Hello. Good morning, good morning. Hi, those watching later on the recording. Welcome, welcome. We've reached the second week of this Lenten series. I named it Layers of Lent because it's folks who laid down their lives. It also ties into our art that we're putting on the wall in the sanctuary. Did anybody peek at that on their way in?
It wasn't there Wednesday night because I looked for it.
It's there. It went up Friday.
Oh, okay.
I wasn't sure if you saw it as you walked in, but it's up there. And I realized that I left this week's pizza sitting on the desk at home, so we'll bring those up when students people can do that. Anyway, but that talks about what we lay down at the foot of the cross during Lent, what we give up, what we want Jesus to carry for us. So it's all these things about what do we lay at Jesus' feet, what do we lay at the cross, and to the point of even laying down our lives. The theme verse of this is from John chapter, I'm going to read it from John chapter 15. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. And Jesus does more than that. He lays down his life for enemies. And that's really what a lot of these stories do. They don't just stick up for their buddies, right, around them, and they are doing that, but they're laying down their lives so that they can be a witness. That's where the word martyr comes from. It's the Greek word related to witness. They're laying down their lives to be a witness to everybody, even those who are actively persecuting them and killing them. And we heard last week that with Perpetua and Felicity, that some of their jailers and persecutors ended up converting to Christianity because of their witness of faith. So that one last week was from the year 202. We're going to slide forward just a little to the year 258. And this is a story that I wasn't familiar with, but is impressive to me. Today we're going to be talking about a deacon named Lawrence. So I want to take you first, transport you back to the book of Acts chapter 6. There was a story about the early community of Christians and the disciples, now apostles are there, and they're getting some complaints. They're saying that, well, the widows and some of the others and the Gentiles aren't getting the food and aren't getting the needed supply, but this group is, and this isn't working. You guys got to address this. So first of all, it's an early instance of there being some conflict in the church, and folks working it out. Right? No, nothing yet. No, but she did use that passage in her conflict training class, the first one. But it is an example of hearing the needs of the people and understanding we need to do something to address this. And so what they did was they appointed deacons. A deacon, it comes from the Greek word diakonos or something like that, which is basically a steward, a server, right? It's there were the pastors in the church. We have pastors and deacons now. The pastors in our system are the ones that are word and sacraments. So we preach and we administer the sacraments, baptism and communion. Deacons in our system today are ministers of word and service. So they have one foot in the church and one foot in the world. And that could be youth ministry, that could be social ministry, working with homeless, working with healthcare, parish nurses maybe. It could be a music ministry, but it's something that isn't just church related. It also extends beyond. They can also preach, but they're not doing sacraments. They're leading folks in paths of service. So the first set of deacons included Stephen. You might remember from the book of Acts, who ended up getting stoned to death as Saul stood by approving, right? So that was the first set of deacons. They appointed 7 deacons who were specifically in charge of ministering to the needs of the poor, the widows, the orphans. They had the treasury. They would hand out money or buy supplies for people as needed. And so that the apostles could focus more on the spread of the gospel in terms of evangelizing and going from town to town and things like that. So they created sort of a division of labor, that body of Christ depended on. So fast forward a couple hundred years to the year 258, and in the church at Rome, right where the emperor lives, they still have deacons. And Lawrence was one of the 7 deacons of the Church of Rome. He was the one who was responsible for the church's financial matters and for the care of the poor, following in the example of those original 7. In the year 257, the year before, Emperor Valerian began a persecution chiefly aimed at the clergy and laity of the upper classes. Why? Because they got money. If they're spending money on Christian church and poor, that means they're not giving as much money to the Romans, to the Senate. I don't know what phase of Roman history, what matches up, but the Senate, the emperor, whatever, they're not giving as much. Their allegiance is split. And so his decree was that all church property would be confiscated and that meetings of Christians would be forbidden. Right? The Bishop of Rome, Sixtus II, and most of his clergy were executed on August 7th, 258. Now, Lawrence's day on the calendar when he was martyred is August 10th, 3 days later. Why? Well, the emperor told him, "You're in charge of the money. Give me all the money." Then Lawrence said, "It'll take me 3 days to get it all together." Well, in those 3 days, right? So 3 days, also symbolic, but so while in those 3 days, what Lawrence did, he said, well, what he was told was to gather the church's treasure. That's what his order was. So he took those 3 days, he gave what money they actually had, trusted others to kind of hide it and steward it. And then when he shows up in front of the emperor, what he shows up with is a collection of orphans, lepers, sick, aged, poor, and widows. The emperor's like, "What is this? Why did you bring all these people?" And the story says that Lawrence's reply was, "These are the treasures of the church."
Like next week. I didn't like that, but then-
The emperor had him put to death.
Oh,
Yeah. Here we go. The emperor ordered him to be roasted alive on a gridiron. That is his emblem. See it. If you are on the video, you're not going to be able to see this. My apologies. Just look up St. Lawrence and you'll see it. But that's like his icon standing there with the fire and the gridiron right next to him. So there were accounts recorded a century later by a gentleman named Ambrose. I don't know if you've heard of him.
And I was St. Ambrose
Yeah.
College and high school, and St. Ambrose Catholic.
Yep, St. Ambrose of Milan. So he wrote down some of these stories and other accounts of early Christianity. There was also a poet named Prudentius, who put Lawrence's story in words. The emperor ordered him to be roasted alive on a gridiron. Lawrence bore the torture with great calmness, according to Ambrose and Prudentius, saying to his executioners at one time, I have two different versions, "You may turn me over, I am done on this side." Or, "The flesh is roasted, turn it and eat." It makes me think of like Bond movies, right? Like but martyrs have this sort of, some of these stories have this sort of bravado. Like Bond is strapped to the chair with the laser, or the shark with a laser coming at it, and he kind of says, and he says something like this, "I'm done. Please flip me over." Like it has this sort of weird, arrogance.
Caveat to this, I had a guy who was in service with him, burned up pretty bad in a Corvair, and he caught fire
Okay.
when he was younger, and he was in the car when it was on fire, and he said, well, I was sat there and thought, well, I don't feel any pain, he says, I'm just gonna sit here and look. I mean, he thought, well, that's pretty stupid. So he got out of the car, he said, but he felt no pain while he was burning, he felt a lot of pain after that. So he didn't see it during the burning, he was going to shock,
You're never
and then he shot that. So he had no pain at all sitting in the car.
so it's possible.
Yeah,
But still, the spectacle of this courage.
it's like the monks in Vietnam.
Oh yeah.
Sat there and burned themselves out.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, think of the faith it takes
Mhm.
to undergo it, whether it's being inflicted on you, you do it to yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. The spectacle of his courage made a great impression on the people of Rome, made many converts, while greatly reducing the belief that Christianity was a socially undesirable movement that should be stamped out. Now, disclaimer. There's some dispute over this account, right? Because if he was a Roman citizen, they wouldn't throw him on the gridiron, he would have been beheaded. And that the report on Bishop Sixtus II and the other deacons is that they were just beheaded on the spot. So, that could mean he either wasn't a Roman citizen, or that the emperor just was like so enraged that he just went extra. Okay. There's also some accounts of a different emperor named Decius, and Valerian was a prefect. Does that matter? Would he have just been convicted and executed at the same time as the others 3 days prior? So, was Lawrence a figure of faith and inspiration? Yes. Are the details of the story possibly exaggerated 100 years later by the time they were written down? Possibly. But if it wasn't so sensational, how could he have come to prominence 100 years later? Why would they have remembered his story? So probably it happened the way it was, and then it got embellished a little bit over time. So I'm going to read to you a little bit from St. Ambrose's account, and then we will move over. Just know, Lois, that the camera is. So we want to make sure you did it.
I don't want to block everybody's view.
I'm going to read all of this. Okay. It's not that, it's that long. Let us not pass by St. Lawrence, Sir Bishop Ambrose, St. Ambrose wrote, who, seeing Sixtus his bishop led to martyrdom, began to weep, not at his sufferings, but at the fact that he himself was to remain behind. Does this sound like last time? With these words, he began to address him. Where, Father, are you going without your son? Where, holy priest, are you hastening without your deacon? Never were you wont to offer sacrifice without an attendant. What are you displeased in me, my father? Have you found me unworthy? Prove then whether you have chosen a fitting servant. To him to whom you have entrusted the consecration of the Savior's blood, to whom you have granted fellowship and partaking of the sacraments, to him do you refuse a part in your death? Beware lest your good judgment be endangered, while your fortitude receives its praise. The rejection of a pupil is the loss of the teacher. Or how is it that noble and illustrious men gain the victory in their contests of their scholars rather than in their own? Abraham offered his son. Peter sent Stephen on before him. Father, show forth your courage and your son. Offer me whom you have trained, that you, confident in your choice of me, may reach the crown in worthy company. Right? Never will you want to offer sacrifice without an attendant. It's that this isn't like this it's not an action. This is seen as an act of worship, as an act of faithfulness. I should be at your side. Sixtus then said, I leave you not nor forsake you. Greater struggles yet await you. We, as old men, have to undergo an easier fight. A more glorious triumph over the tyrant awaits you, a young man. Soon shall you come. Cease weeping. After 3 days you shall follow me. This interval must come between the priest and his Levite. It was not for you to conquer under the eye of your master, as though you needed a helper. Why do you seek to share in my death? I leave to you its full inheritance. Why do you need my presence? Let the weak disciples go before their master. Let the brave follow him, that they may conquer without him. For they no longer need his guidance. So Elijah left Elisha. To you I entrust the full succession, to my own courage. And it's the story of bringing the treasure, flesh is roasted, turn it into eat. What greater treasures has Christ than those in whom he says he himself lives? For thus it is written, I was hungry and you gave me to eat. You gave me to eat, different archaic language. I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. I was a stranger and you took me in. And again, what you did to one of these, you did it unto me. What better treasures has Jesus than those in which he loves to be seen? That to me is the most powerful part of the story. Not the turn me over, I'm done. But that he would bring this group of widows and orphans and the sick lepers and say, this is Christ's treasure, because Jesus taught us what you do to the least of these you do. These treasures, Lawrence pointed out, and prevailed, for the persecutors could not take them away. Jehoiakim, who preserved his gold during the siege and spent it not in providing food, saw his gold carried off, himself led into captivity. Lawrence, who preferred to spend the gold of the church on the poor, rather than to keep it in hand for the persecutor, received the sacred crown of martyrdom for the unique and deep-sighted figure of his meaning. Or was it perhaps said to Holy Lawrence, "Thou should not spend the treasures of the church, or sell the sacred vessels"? So there you go. That's the story of Lawrence Deacon. Had anybody ever heard of this? This was a new one to me too. So it's worth it to open up your hymnals to the front and start skimming the names on the integrations page. This is good stuff. Okay. So last week I did this whole setup. I'm not going to repeat all of it again. That was about why we tell stories. Okay. That to share the gospel, we get comfortable sharing stories of faith, using our own language, using our own experiences, but also working in language of the Bible, of the church history, of the things we talk about in church, so that it's personal, but that it just becomes as familiar to you as talking about your own faith, right? You just incorporate that. You know, Pentecostals and evangelicals and Baptists are real good about just dropping scripture or saying, you know, I'm going to pray for this person, or just making faith part of that. In my experience, that comes across still a little bit
holier than thou.
like in your face. I don't know. So, but that's who they are. That's their face. So I wanted to come out from all y'all and all y'all.
Look at you using y'all so that.
I picked that up in Greek class. Because there's no English word that says second person plural. Unless you're from what, Pennsylvania, they're used. So, but y'all is really, and my grandma's from Alabama, so it's in there. It's in there. And y'all can be, I know y'all, but then all y'all. Oh, yes, I'm sure. My wife taught me well. She spent a lot of time in North Carolina.
West, it's guys. Hey, you guys.
Hey, you guys. Hey, you guys. Use guys. Use guys. That's if you're in a mom. Yeah. So the I don't know if I told you this last week. So the title of this study was Inspiring Stories of Faith, right? These are inspiring stories of faith, but I'm also hoping that this class will inspire your stories of faith. That reading these will inspire you to tell your own. Now, I'm not saying that all of these have to be personal. Remember last week how much crickets we had before we finally got to, a little bit lower, deeper layers, right? So it could also be other stories that you have heard, stories that have inspired you that aren't on the church calendar. Could be people you know in your family, could be people you've read about in history classes or seen on the news. So when I open it up for stories right now, I'm hoping we can get some of your own in here, but also you can share some that have been inspiring to you. So for today, we had this story of Lawrence, right? It was a story of speaking truth to power. That was last week too. Standing up to somebody who's over you. In this case, an emperor, could be a manager, could be anything. Somebody who's got power over you. So you're risking a lot. So the first type of story I could invite would be a story of speaking truth to power despite the risk or consequences. It could be you or something that's inspirational to you. I have an example. Another, Kate's got a great teacher. I already talked earlier about this World War II museum. It's before the recording started. But she sets these things up. She also, Kate was doing the Battle of the Books. And one of the books they read was called All the Way to the Top. And it's the story of one young lady and others who got the Americans with Disability Act passed. And one of the stories in this illustrated book was of this young woman wanting to testify to Congress about this bill, and there was no way for her to get in the building. So she got out of her wheelchair and dragged herself up the steps of Congress to get in to testify, right? So it could be something like that. It could be a story, something like that. It could be like a civil rights story. I know you had mentioned something earlier, about a couple weeks ago. I think John Lewis is inspiring to me. I read his graphic novel that he helped write about his own story of growing up. Martin Luther King, of course, so many more. Tiananmen Square comes to mind. That's coming back up in the books again lately. So those are some examples. So that's option one. Share a story of speaking truth to power despite the risk or consequences. Option two. Share a story of unlikely treasure. Holy treasure. Meeting God in the least of these kind of things. So those are your two options, speaking truth to power or unlikely treasure. Or is yours? And for those at home, if you want to send one in later, we'll talk about it later.
Well, somebody standing up against the man is Aaron Brockovich.
Oh, sure.
She did it early on, and then she made a movie of her. She's back in the limelight again.
Yeah,
I thought she was a lot older than what she is, according to how long that movie was played, but she doesn't look that old. So she must have been quite young when she was in it the first time around.
Yeah. Is anybody not familiar with Aaron Brockovich? Everybody knows Aaron Brockovich? Okay, yeah, that was a good movie, Julia Roberts.
Yes.
Yeah, standing up to a big company.
Mhm.
There's a lot of movies that tell those stories based on true events, especially things about corruption, pollution.
And she's in the news now about, I think,
He's been
train derailment, I think.
Been reading or actually listening to a story on Audible. It's not really a story, it's called Leaders. And it's based on 4 of the presidents. And I was really impressed with, well, both the Roosevelts were pretty religious. But Theodore Roosevelt came into the presidency when there was a coal strike. And he went against big odds to help them settle that dispute. And I think it was him when he was inaugurated. You could see he actually bent down and said a prayer. And I just thought that was, bucking the system.
And he was a big trust breaker, wasn't he? Like in terms of,
Mhm.
and those monopolies were really getting big at that time. I should have said, so why are these stories inspiring to you? So what about Teddy Roosevelt? What about Aaron Brockovich? What is it about them that's inspiring? Since you just
They had courage to do that, and they were really going up against some really difficult odds to have settle those disputes, and he just exemplified his Christianity.
How about you, Roger? What is it about Aaron?
I don't know if Karen would say it's a Christian that way. I don't know that much about it. But the first time she was standing up for protesting, her life was threatened. It didn't slow her down. So it didn't stop her from doing it. This time, I don't think that's the case. But the first time, her life was actually threatened several times because she was going against powers. So she didn't stop, even though she was threatened.
And they don't have to be Christian stories because God is still working in this world. So you can find that inspiration in all corners. You don't want to say, hey,
I just don't know nothing about
right.
it.
And if she wasn't, you'd be like, hey, Aaron, you're being so Christian. She might be like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
But you can still say, hey, your story inspired me and it makes me want to live my faith out. Because it reminds me of this. That's different. And that's how you tell these stories. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? I hope so, because we got a lot of time.
This is a completely different story.
Yeah.
And I never had the chance to talk about it. I was working all my life for the same company. So owner was a very successful businessman. He was Catholic. And I was vice president. I was on his side all the time. So I wondered, you did it, and don't you know? He said, yeah, but I give part of it back to the church on Sunday. But in the end, like, we're his friends. He invited them every year to his condo in Florida, Boca Raton. And they just loved that.
Sure.
And whenever he had a question, they answered positive. So everything, whatever he wanted, so. What do you say to that?
That's hard. It's hard to be in that situation. It's nice that he turned around and donated
Yeah,
some to the church.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily making things right with the people getting cheated.
yeah,
That was to clear his own conscience probably, so.
yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, what do you say? Cause that's your livelihood.
Mhm.
So how did it turn out?
But he, uh,
Good.
I mean, he,
You kept your job and in the end, he rewarded you.
yeah. I mean, after he passed away, I became president of the company. And then he had, in his last will, since we didn't have any insurance or anything, he left the company to us. And he had a lawyer in Florida. He, every summer he went to Florida because it wasn't a good business. Season started like in October and ended in May. And during the summer he was in Germany, visited customers in Europe and all that. So he left us a company, and then the lawyer in Florida took it in his hands. So then he had like percentage wise divided, and it was a tough time to take care. And yeah, for me being the president, I was responsible for everything. And even then, after everything was clear, the IRS came and looked for vacant somewhere, and I had already closed the books, and just for security, I had a storage here and mechanics with all the files, and then they wanted this set, so I had to go through all the files and by hand and put everything together. That was another 2 years. It was crazy, you know.
Yeah.
So at the end, I felt I deserved my part. And then when I paid the other guys, only one of them said thank you.
Oh, man.
It's hard when it is stuck in a system.
You were talking about situations where they went against the man, brings to mind, Spielberg's Schindler's List.
Oh, sure.
He was playing both ends against the middle, he was, working for the regime, but also working against it, so. That takes, that tight wire is really difficult.
There's plenty of stories from periods of history like that. We read one in an ethics class in seminary about a small village in occupied France that took in a bunch of Jewish people. And it's not just that regime, it's, you can find those stories. And it might not be walking up to the emperor and, snub, thumbing your, what is it? Thumbing your nose in his face with all these poor people. Sometimes it's that behind the scenes stuff. Sometimes you have to bide your time until you can, there's not one right way to do it. But when you hear the stories, they tend to be very inspiring because I think most folks recognize when you're in the middle of a system or a culture and you know what the risks are to push back against it, you know when you hear these stories what they were risking. Because I think everybody knows at least a little bit what it would mean to risk your livelihood or your life or your job to
Well, he would have risked all of it if he got caught.
right. And so I think folks know a little bit of that tension, even if it's not on this scale.
The story of Corrie ten Boom was always very impressive to me too. She helped to hide the Jewish people and get them to a safe place. And then, when they were finally caught and she was put in prison, Corey said in the book that she wasn't so sure about her faith in God at first, but then she began to see, in prison the things that were from God, and it changed her view. She really became, a leader in, having everybody, or as many as wanted to participate in Bible studies, even within their barracks, which were full of lice and everything else.
Yeah.
And I was just really impressed with the way she encouraged other people in the faith at that time. Well, while she was still in prison.
I'm gonna use that story as a little bit of a pivot. I've shared a couple times now about a pastor and a bishop from Ethiopia that I read an autobiography about, who just was killed and hidden, and nobody knew what exactly happened for like 30 years. Well, his wife, who also worked at the church and stood by him, a few years later was also arrested and thrown into jail. And so she survived, but she wrote these accounts about her legs getting wrecked, about bugs and squalor in the prison, about what it took to get, any kind of supplies and sticking to her faith in that. So I want to use that as a pivot to the other possible storytelling opportunity of unlikely treasure, finding God in unlikely places. That was one of Martin Luther's big things, was that a theologian of glory looks to find God in the things that the world says are powerful and important, right? The kings, the money, the things like that. But a theologian of the cross says, it calls a thing what it is, and that that God showed his power the most brightly by Jesus emptying himself, dying on the cross to save us, and the least of these, and touching the leper, and Stephen letting himself be stoned to death, with all these types of stories. So what are some unlikely treasure stories? Seeing God in unlikely places.
I've seen it a lot in my work, just doing in-home work and hospice and home health. Like some of the strongest faith stories that I've heard have come from people living in the most, just worried about having to get food, or they're the ones that are the patient on hospice, they're the one near death. Like hearing those stories of just strong faith, especially those that don't have as much. Just seeing it there. And I was at a patient's hospice not long ago, and this story just sat with me. It was just so strong. There was this elderly couple, they're in their 90s, both of them, and the one woman was out at the grocery store, and they live in their own home, they're by themselves, and the one woman was out in Walmart, she was pushing her cart, and this lady came up to her and said, "Can I help you?" And she was like, "Oh, sure, you can help me unload my groceries onto the cart." She's like, "No, do you need help, in your life?" And she's like, "Well, I don't know what's God." And she's like, "Well, think about it," and gave her her card, or gave her a piece of paper with her number on it. And the woman went home, and weeks later, she's like, "I'm gonna call her. I could use some help with your meals and like work." She called the woman, and the woman came in, has been helping them in their home. It's increased more and more now, but I taught, the woman was there during my visit, and her name is Barbara, and I was talking with her. I was like, "How did you get connected with him? How did this happen?" She said, "I was caring for my father for so long, and I said, after he passed, I said, God, give me somebody else to take care of. Give me somebody else that I can help in their life." And she said she's met several elderly couples in Walmart, passed the information on. She spends her days, she's retired, she spends her days all day going to different houses, cooking a breakfast here, going to another house, cooking a breakfast, coming back, cleaning up, doing light chores. And that to me was just, talk about a calling. And the woman, and she said that she even went to church, Barbara, the one that was caring for all these elderly folks. She said she went to church that weekend talking about my patient's spouse. And she's like, "I just met this incredible woman. I had this connection with her. I think she thought it was really bizarre and odd. I don't know if she'll ever reach out to me, but I really hope she does. I feel like I could do something for her." And weeks later, she just connected, and I mean, I just thought it was just so powerful, very strong. That was. She said she just asked. She needed somebody else to take care of. She needed something else, and they provided.
And it's not like it used to be. The elderly in our society are not necessarily given the same amount of value and respect as they once were. Like, oh well, they lived a good life, or I remember during the pandemic, like, whoa, it would be honoring the country if they died, because they'll help build a herd immunity and stuff like that. It's stuff like that, but it's,
So like,
or, you know, folks that, I remember when I was a kid, in high school,
Sylvester was.
my mom signed up to take the flowers from church to nursing homes. That was one of the things our church did. And I tag along sometimes. Some of the nursing homes were really nice. Some of them were not. It was just folks parked in the hallways, moaning, lonely, and forgotten. So yeah, for somebody to say, I'm gonna devote my life to helping folks that are in that situation, I think that would, yeah, definitely.
Just reminded years ago, I think, because my kids were little, our women's group used to go every month to the nursing home in Ashland and do a birthday party. And, for anybody who had a birthday that month, and somebody made something that we gave, but I don't remember now what it was. So they all got a little something, and, some of us would took our little kids along when we went, and they loved to see all the little kids, but, and times it was like, oh, no, we're doing this again, but in many ways, I think we probably got as much or more out of it than the people. But people, you know, I think they look forward to us coming, and not just the cake.
Has anybody ever gone on a mission trip? Has anybody ever served at a soup kitchen?
Not soup kitchen, but some of us here soup they come in and buy their can, or pick up their canned soup, but
Sure, and
you know, at MSF, every week we see, this week I sat and talked to a lady whose daughter had just been with her fiance, but he was sitting at the table and he took out a gun and put his on his head. That's her daughter, saw that. The stories we hear there, you know, there's one lady, she was the cafeteria manager at Stonewall for years. She now has like 6 people living in her house who are obviously taking advantage of her. And, you know, we hear all kinds of stories. Yeah. We've gotten a lot of refugees right now. We've got to learn Farsi and Spanish real quick because we are having trouble communicating.
Yeah. It's very easy to paint with a wide brush about homeless or poor people. But when you sit down, when you're putting food on everybody's plate, and you see some folks are homeless, some are veterans, some have mental illness, some had a health issue that wiped out their savings, some are on fixed income and can maybe afford the food, but they just want the company. There's no single pigeonhole. But yeah, when you look at people eye to eye, when you're sitting down listening to their stories, when you go on a mission trip, whether it's, you know, Melissa's led some youth mission trips back in the day to different cities to a company called YouthWorks, and you know, I've talked to people who've gone on mission trips to other countries, and you think you're gonna go there and help these poor people, right? You're gonna make their lives better. And those testimonies of faith, the witness that you see while you're there, you know, you might have painted a wall or built a small house or brought some food. We had a member of our past congregation was a nurse and then became a nurse practitioner. Every year she'd go on a mission trip to Peru or Central America or Romania and do medical care for folks for free. And they come back changed.
One of the ladies said something a few weeks ago. Judy and I sort clothes, and some of the clothes people donate, you know, are, you know, this one thing I think was awful. And this lady sitting there, she's one of the clients, and she said, you know, we may be poor, but we still have dignity. And I think sometimes people forget that, you know,
It's easy to say, well, you put yourself in this situation. That is not always the case, and even when it is, it's still human beings.
so she didn't want somebody's rags, she still,
Yeah. I always, well, these are the kinds of stories that you don't just force them into conversation, but you find a way to tell these stories to folks outside of these walls too, and just talk about our God who treasures the lowly, our God who finds ways to meet us through the lowly, through the least of these. You find ways to tell these stories about folks who risked everything for their convictions, for their faith sometimes, and how that teaches you or opens up to you the story of what Jesus did. Because it might seem to other people that's something in the book that's a couple thousand years old. What does that mean? And so you bring it into your life and you bring it into the stories of today or history. And then you can tell, you go the other direction. This helps me understand Jesus. Puts meat on the bones of this old story. Yeah, more time.
Oh, I was gonna share, it wasn't a mission trip, per se, it was
Sure.
a mission day. I was part of Mechanical Christians for the Cleanse. They do an extreme, a day of extreme makeover for women and children who are homeless. And they've been in battered situations, most likely. They've had to leave their spouses and then now they're homeless, and they brought in large amounts of women, children, all ages. The younger children would go up and do Bible lessons and stories and play, but the teenage children, the girls and their moms would come into, they had set up in their gym stations. There was a pedicure station, a manicure station, a go pick out an outfit station, an accessory station, a makeup station, and I was part of the manicure station. And just to hear the story, they would sit there and just say, gosh, so, we would do like we would have in a salon, we sat there and we would massage their hands, and we were the first station that most women would start with. They were kind of a little quiet, kind of warming up, and then to watch them go through each of the stations, and at the end of the day, it was, if they wanted to participate in a fashion show, and to watch these women and these children or these teen women, one came back to me after they were all dolled up and everything, was just so excited to say, look, I started with my nails and now look, look, I have my hair done. They had a hair, they would cut hair, they would style hair, they had a full 9 yards done, and it was just, I went like, this is just gonna be great, be a part of giving to them, but I left that day and I came and was like, oh my gosh, that was just amazing to watch the transformation and these women and children who, homeless, and really trying to figure out how to get away from these awful situations and the day-to-day struggles that we can't even imagine that they're going through. But to have that day of just feeling glamorous and having people sitting there rubbing their feet, that pedicure station, there were a lot of tears in that station. Like you could just see there was a lot of emotion going on. But washing the feet and
Yeah. I was
that
saying,
whole process.
How do you translate that story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet today?
And some women were very embarrassed. And we were all trained ahead of time. You're going to see everything, and we all knew what was happening and what may or may not occur. And so I'm really embarrassed my feet. It's okay. It doesn't matter. Just to put everybody at ease, or with their hands, or with their hair. It's okay. And then to watch that fashion, go across the stage at the end of the day, the confidence, it was just a very cool experience.
So what do you think contributed to that information at the end? Was it the clothes and the makeup?
No. It was that feeling of value and appreciation. And a lot of women would tell their stories, but I think it was a release for them as well. Feeling a little vulnerable, maybe in that situation, but feeling comfortable and knowing that they were in a safe place.
That's the domestic abuse situation. It's not just violence, it's stripping away your confidence and your self-worth so that you won't fight back, so you do stay in this situation. And you think this is the best I deserve, but
No, not quite as drastic. That's Doctors Without Borders.
sure.
I don't know what kind of situation if they're ever in a situation, because I don't know that much about it, whether the life is threatened or not. But I think probably so, if nothing else, the disease they could probably acquire because where they are. And, you sometimes get very jaded about doctors and the money that costs and the cost of medical and where's your Hippocratic oath, but that kind of brings it back that if you have a little bit, but I found out later, after my doctor retired, that's when you get the hope when the doctor retires. But I found out later on, I sat with him every time I go in, he'd want to talk to me because he always put me towards the end of the day And so we would sit in his office and shoot the breeze for 30 minutes afterwards.
Sure.
And that's when he brought up, and every week he did a pro bono at the clinic, free of charge. So I don't know how many doctors do that, but he did. So I have a little different idea about doctors from that situation than I did before, where they were just money grubbing maniacs. So, you know, there is a Hippocratic oath in those doctors, even though they in most of them anyway.
I guess I think as I think of it, we talk about these wonderful big experiences, and they are great to hear about. But most of us don't have those big experiences, and I was sitting here thinking that, if you go to the grocery store, and, which I did recently, and left something in the bottom of the cart and checked out, went out and got in the cart, and looked at their item and said, oh, no, I didn't pay for this. And so you close your car and you take the item and you go back in the store and you pay for it. That is an example, not of standing up to power, but of standing up for a principle. Sure. And it teaches that person at the cash register, she may have known that already, but teaches her something too. And so I guess I think most of those are little experiences. My husband had the opportunity once when he was first starting out and was working with a big corporation. His boss, his new boss, wanted to get what should we say, get some payback for being kind to him or giving him the best assignments. And he wanted money. And the guy's in jail now. But, well, no, years have gone by, so he's like out of jail by now. But, Bob said at the time, well, I never thought about the fact that I was young and I was probably gonna lose this battle. You just stand up. And I think most of us, or all of us, probably.
I think a lot of things like that we don't see. It's what we do.
Do it.
We do it. We don't see any kind of, one case happened when I was in the Navy. And I went up, and got my, at those times, early on, you got a government check. Later on, they paid you in cash, or in your bank account, but at one point, they just wrote you a check, and you just endorsed it, and they pay you for it, that's how they did it. So you got the check, you signed it, and they gave you money for it, and so that's how they kept your account. Well, I didn't sign it there at the base, I went to my bank to put it in the bank. And the whole paycheck was I was supposed to put half of the checking account, the other half in the savings account. Well, what the lady did was she gave me a full check in both cases.
Oh.
So she doubled my paycheck. She put full amount in the account and also gave me the cash for it. And I didn't realize.
Still did not balance at the end of the
I
day.
didn't realize until I got home.
Sure.
Because I didn't count it. And I do count that. And at that point, I was quite young and I didn't count it. She said, "Well, I just went home with it." And I started reading the count. That's all here. And I got mad because she didn't put it in the checking account. Or in the savings account. So I go back and I check my account. And she did put it in the savings account, but she doubled everything. So I went back and went back to the bank.
Yeah.
And told him that she doubled my paycheck. And the guy looked at me like I had two heads. You know, and he said, "What are you doing?" Because there's no way they could catch me at it. You know?
Right.
What would happen at the end of the day, that teller would have had to pay for that.
Right.
They would have charged her
They
for that.
might have called you.
But they would have, well, he told me she would have been liable for that out of her paycheck.
They've changed that since.
Yeah, well, that's at that time, would have allowed that young lady's paycheck. And the guy looked at me like, "What are you doing here?" You know, you're free and clear. There's no way they can catch it. You're I'm back.
Marty probably went home and told a couple of his friends about that. Sure, guy.
Naive idiot, yeah.
Story followed.
Stories are so powerful, right? And there's all the statistics about if you have a negative customer service experience, you're like 10 times more likely to tell that. But if you have a good experience, you should tell those too.
Well,
I can't see public manager was talking about good service.
Right.
Oh, I think.
We try to make a point so because so many times even, oh, here's complaints.
So it's really easy, I think, to not broadcast these stories about small things or big things that you have done. Because I think we have that sort of baked into our culture and in church, like, well, no, you need to be humble, right? You don't wanna toot your own horn, you know, it's not about you. So it, you know, it could be, have you ever heard of a humble brag? Ever heard that term? A humble brag, like, oh, well, you know, I donate, I do donate half my salary.
Yeah.
That's like, it sounds like you said, the words are humble, but you're bragging, right? So you don't wanna do that, you don't wanna come across like, aren't I great, look at all the nice things I did. But that's, I think, why Paul writes so much about boasting, why there's so many things in his letters where it's like, it's, you know, it's Christ in me, it's these things that are happening, you know, that. So it's not about me, I'm gonna boast in Christ for my salvation, for my good works, it's not about me. That's hard to do though. Because we have, I learned from one of my favorite teachers in seminary. He was a ordained pastor and a biblical scholar and a current licensed psychologist. And he would bring together those two worlds in ways I wish I could describe. He would give lectures and there was no way you could take notes. Because he was just telling stories and I read this in the news and I saw this on the movie I was just about, and there's this thing in the Bible, and you're like, what are you doing, Dan? And then he'd bring it all together and he'd be like, I can't remember all of it, but every time it was just knock us over. And I kind of wish, anyway, he had a class called, shoot, what was it called? It was evolutionary psychology and the gospel or something like that. So there's this field of psychology called evolutionary psychology. Why do we crave sugar? Why do we remember losses more than victories? Like things like that. Studying the brain, studying, you know, ancient ancestors and things like that. And he would tie that stuff into the gospel. And it was amazing. And one of them was, it's finally getting to the point. One of them was that we are built in, every human being is hardwired to be a cheater detector and a lie detector and a hypocrite detector, right? We are constantly scanning other people's body language, facial expressions, do their actions meet their words all the time to see if they're trustworthy, because yeah. So if you are a person going, you know, I want to tell you a story about this good deed that I did. People right away are gonna be scanning you just to finish up. So it's tricky to tell these kinds of stories. But if you're doing it, you have to boast in Christ. You have to talk about the unlikely treasures that Jesus came to me in the least of these. So it's not about the nice thing you did, but it's about how you met Jesus and this other person. That's the tricky part. It's hard. It takes practice. That's why we're practicing now. Because it could come across as a humble brag. It could come across as, you know, well, so what that you gave your paycheck back? So what that you took that carton of soda back inside and paid for it?
That's the right thing to do.
Yeah, it was just the right thing to do. So, you know, why are you trying to get extra attention for it? So if you can somehow pivot to make it about how you met Christ in the least of these, how it made you realize something else about faith. So it's not about you. That's the truth.
That's true.
It is.
Well, I always told my kids, you know, you get reward with the reaction, whether it's positive or negative. There's always gonna be, you always get a reward, whether, you know, it's negative or positive, depending on what you do. You may not always like the reward, but you always get a reward from your situation, you know, if you put yourself. Positive or negative.
We're getting close. Instead of going over, we'll do it now. Are there any other?
Did some professor ever write a book about that?
He constantly talked about the book he was writing, but as far as I know. And see, there was a woman from town who would, you know, people would come in and just audit some classes. And she had become like his assistant slash almost acolyte. Like she had a digital recorder. She would record all his classes. I think he's still alive, but I think he has declined some over the years. He's retired. He's moved up to the Twin Cities to be closer to his daughter. But he was the most remarkable teacher, and in a way that you could not take notes on. And so I hope those recordings are still out there. I hope somebody does, maybe his daughter or somebody eventually put some of it together.
Put an audio book or something.
Yeah, I would, yeah. And he also, he just moved as he talked. He just was always active, keeping moving. And there was this one time where he had a glass of water. And he made a point. There was a guy in Scott in the front row who just got doused. David Olson was on such a roll that even the guy who got doused, everybody just kind of went.
What it said.
He was, but he was great, and I tell lots of stories about us and he taught pastoral care. That's what he taught. Loss and grief, stress and depression, ministering to folks in times of anxiety or, conflict. That's what he taught.
Well, you find people that like it in all walks of life. When I was in college, I basically get through basic math, and I had to have a math course in order to graduate, so I took this basic math course. We were all idiots in here, everyone was, we're all humanities majors, and so the farthest you can get away from math, the better off you were. So we would sit in, this guy was very eccentric, he looked like Einstein, the same kind of hair and everything, and he wore a 1940s double-breasted suit with high-ball sneakers, and he rode to school every day on a bicycle. And you could see the man was brilliant, but we'd be sitting in that class like a bunch of dummies, and somebody would ask us a question that anybody else would be embarrassed for in most math classes, and he would stop and say, well, he would be like, he said, well, if you have this problem, I would imagine there's probably 12 more in here. And he would stop his class and preach or speak or teach on that particular thing. And what happened, we found out, and anyway, I found out that some things that most math teachers thought was obvious, wasn't to some people, and they were too embarrassed to ask. So if you didn't get that obvious point, the rest of it was mute. And so I got it. In high school, I got D's studying all the time. In that course, I got a B. I got drafted and enlisted, and next thing I know, I'm gonna sit in a math class for 5 days a week, 8 hours a day for 7 weeks with a so I mean, the man turned my life. I guess I'm trying to say is that's where my life turned upside down and moved opposite 180 out of where I was headed.
What was his name?
I don't remember.
Okay. So this is what I want to look at. This is a great last story to do, because I think this kind of bridges the gap of a lot of the other things we're talking about. This teacher is a saint.
He used to me.
Because
forget it.
you were just describing yourself as a math idiot,
Yeah.
as somebody who was not a treasure in that department.
Not at
And
all.
he treated you with value, with dignity, with respect, and he took the time to help you and your classmates do that. And maybe he's not standing up to power, maybe it's not that side of the coin. But it definitely wasn't how the rest of the world.
He was being close to my life.
Right? So how can you do that for others? How can you create those spaces where other people can feel valuable, treasured, whether it's the manicures and pedicures, not treating you like you're an idiot just because it doesn't come easy to you, doing the right thing, and maybe all of those things together build up if you find yourself in a Schindler's List position, in a Lawrence the Deacon position. Maybe you find yourself like, maybe I'm the one that needs to hide the money and bring the poor people. So you don't know when that opportunity is going to present itself, and it could be in the big way or the everyday way. So not only, like I said, are these inspiring stories, but I hope they are stories that inspire you. That you can turn around and be this in the world, and somehow put meat on the bones of the gospel. Because it's so easy for it to become a heady thing, a historical thing, something you do in church thing. But to take these experiences in and outside of church and put meat on them, make them incarnate, make them sacramental out in the world. That's what I'm hoping we can get out of this, that you guys practice.
That's what the children has made such a big impression, and Lisa made a huge impression on me. I've watched this episode a couple times, but it's that putting some real life to the people, whether it's true or not.
Yeah.
But and the new session started.
Good. I don't anything else?
Write down the professor's name and I'll Google it and see what I can find.
Okay, I will do that. We'll stop the recording. Thank you, everybody. And your Lent devotions this week, if you were at the Wednesday night service, we're making prayer tables. if you can find ways to make that a piece of your prayers at your prayer tables, or just your prayers in general, you know. Reflect on these things. Stories that inspire you and how you can bring that forward. Blessed to be a blessing. That's my children's sermon days. I'm gonna go stop that recording. Thank you, everybody.
With that, man, all over. I should by now. Five, it's before anybody.